If you follow the news, you know the drill, especially during an election year. We are just bombarded with opinion polls, right? They're everywhere, telling us who's up and who's down. But lately, after some really spectacular misses, there's a huge question hanging over all of them.
I mean, think back to 2020. The polls were pretty much all pointing to a comfortable win for Joe Biden. But the actual result? It was way, way closer. And this wasn't just some small statistical blip. It was a massive, systemic miss that really made people wonder, hey, can we even trust polls anymore? So today, we're going to dig in and try to figure out what exactly went wrong.
Okay, so to figure out what broke, we first have to understand how polls are supposed to work in the first place. And the basic idea behind them is actually really elegant, and it's been around for quite a while.
At its core, an opinion poll is basically a clever shortcut. You know, instead of trying to ask every single person in a country what they think, which, let's be honest, would be completely impossible, pollsters talk to a much smaller, really carefully chosen group. We call that a sample. And the whole goal is to make that tiny sample a perfect little miniature version of the entire population.
So what's the secret sauce? It's all about random sampling. Think of it like this. If you're making a giant pot of soup and you stir it really well, you don't have to eat the entire thing to know if it needs more salt, right? You just need one spoonful, because that spoonful has a little bit of everything in it. A good poll works exactly the same way. A truly random sample should have a representative mix of the whole country.
And this idea has been evolving for a long time. It all started with these informal straw polls in newspapers way back in 1824. Then, you had the Literary Digest trying to do this huge mail-in survey. But the real game changer? That came in 1936. A guy named George Gallup came along and proved that a smaller but way more scientific sample was much more accurate. And that pretty much set the stage for all modern polling.
So if the theory is that simple, why do polls still get it so wrong sometimes? Well, it's kind of like a recipe. If you mess up one key ingredient, the whole thing can just be a total disaster. So let's look at the classic ways a poll can go completely off the rails.
Let's go back to that 1936 election, because it is the perfect example. The Literary Digest polled more than 2 million people. That's a huge number, but their sample was totally biased. See, they got their names from phone books and car registration lists. Back in the Great Depression, who had phones and cars? Wealthier people. So their samples skewed rich. Meanwhile, George Gallup used a much smaller but truly representative sample, and he nailed the result. It's the ultimate lesson. Bigger isn't better. Representative is what really matters.
So that 1936 fiasco is a textbook case of what we call coverage bias. Their list of people just didn't cover everyone. But that's not the only pitfall. There's also non-response bias, which happens when certain kinds of people are way less likely to even answer the poll. Then you have response bias. That's when people might not tell the truth because they feel pressured to give the right answer. And sometimes the problem is baked right into the question itself.
Just look at this question from a poll back in 1992. Does it seem possible or impossible? I mean, that double negative is just designed to confuse you. And it did. A shocking 22% of people said it seemed possible the Holocaust never happened. When the pollsters rephrased the question clearly, that number dropped to just 1%. It's a perfect illustration of how just changing a few words can totally warp the results.
Okay, so all of that brings us back to 2020. The polls were off by a lot, and none of those usual suspects seemed to fully explain what happened. So a team of experts decided it was time to launch a full-blown investigation.
Right after the election, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, we'll just call them APOR, put together a task force to get to the bottom of it. Their report is basically our roadmap as we try to solve the mystery of the 2020 polling miss.
First things first, just how big was the problem? Well, the task force found that in the last 2 weeks of the election, the average error on the margin in state-level presidential polls was 5.1 points. That is not a small error. That's a really significant miss.
And the error wasn't random either. It was consistently skewed in one direction. The polls overstated the Democratic lead by an average of 4.3 points in the presidential race. But get this, the error was even bigger in Senate and governor races, a full 6 points. So this wasn't just about one candidate, this was a much broader issue.
So, the task force started their investigation by ruling out the easy explanations. Was it a big last-minute swing from undecided voters like we saw in 2016? Nope, the data didn't support that. Okay, what about shy voters who are maybe lying to pollsters? Well, probably not, because the error also happened in anonymous online polls, and it was even worse in some non-presidential races. And it wasn't a simple demographic mistake, like not having enough voters without a college degree. They tried fixing that, and it didn't solve the problem. The mystery just kept getting deeper.
So, with all the usual suspects cleared, the investigation started pointing toward a much more fundamental and, honestly, a much more difficult problem for the entire polling industry.
The task force eventually concluded that the most likely culprit was, in fact, non-response bias. But this was a new flavor of it. It wasn't just about certain groups being harder to reach. It was about who was actively choosing not to participate, and, crucially, why they were making that choice. And here is the absolute key finding from the APOR report. They suggested that in our deeply polarized world, the very act of participating in a poll might have become a political statement. The theory is that people who are most skeptical of institutions, like the media or academia, who are often linked with polling, may have just decided to refuse to answer polls altogether, almost as a form of protest. And this is the core of the huge new challenge pollsters are facing. See, standard polling fixes are designed to correct for demographic imbalances. We didn't get enough men under 40, or we need more people without a college degree. But how in the world do you adjust for a political or psychological trait like a person's fundamental distrust of institutions? If the most passionate supporters of one side are systematically opting out, your sample is just broken from the start and your results are going to be skewed.
So this leaves us with a really profound and kind of unsettling question. Polling is built on this foundation of cooperation, this idea that a random group of people will be willing to share their opinions to help us understand the whole country. But what happens if that very act of cooperation becomes a political choice? It strikes at the very heart of what makes polling work, and that is the massive puzzle that pollsters are desperately trying to solve right now.